In this episode, I talk with Tibetologist, translator, and Tantric Buddhist meditation teacher Glenn Mullin about the fascinating subject of dream yoga. We begin by discussing Glenn's own training in the 6 Yogas of Naropa with specific detail about his own solo retreats, including a special dream yoga retreat in which Glenn remained upright for weeks, never laying down, to deeply penetrate the world of sleep and dreams. We also talk about how to unlock the historically suppressed human inheritance of deep states of consciousness and extraordinary abilities, including dream travel and ancestral communication. So, without further ado, Glenn Mullin. So, Glenn, thank you once again for coming back on the podcast.
My joy, my pleasure, and my honor.
So we've been trekking through the peaks and valleys of the 6 yogas in these last few episodes. And I thought now, as we're in episode 4 of our series here, I thought we'd come back and circle round again to how you learned the 6 yogas. In some Kagyu sects, for example, I understand that the 6 yogas are sometimes taught in group 3-year retreats. And I know you had some really quite remarkable teachers from the Gelugpa sect, such as Lingrim Rinpoche and others. Can you tell us a bit about how you learned the 6 yogas and what that learning process was like?
Yeah, I think one of the main differences between Kagyu and Gelugpa, or Kagyu and Nyingma, as compared to Gelugpa Sakya, I should say also, is that Kagyu and Nyingma often tend to do group retreats, anywhere from 10 to 30 people, in a kind of an enclosed situation often, and sort of a lot of group practice. Whereas Gelugpa, and also to some extent Sakya, retreats are done usually individually. It's only some monasteries doing some kind of mantra count retreats where they want to do the what's called as a leirung, the qualifying retreat, and the fire rite that gives them authorization to do a particular kind of rituals, sort of public service rituals, you could say, or community rituals. And those often will be done as community retreats, in other words, group retreats. And that was very common, for instance, in Dharamsala, in the various monasteries, with those quorum of monks who specialize in rituals, ritual performance. And so they want to participate in the Losar, Torgya, Vajrakilya, Dorje Purpa, burning of the effigy into which all the negativities of the past year were collected. They would do a 30-day collective retreat or a community retreat, and anywhere from 20 to more monks would do together. So Kagyu and Nyingma, usually they do like that, and they have a special kind of retreat building they do it in. I guess one of the benefits of that is that everyone keeps on one another's case. And so there's no getting out of it without getting caught kind of thing. Whereas Gelugpa and to some extent Sakya, most retreats are done solitary. I've never done a group retreat in my life with Gelugpa lamas like that. And Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa did it in Nepal, like Kopan Monastery and stuff like that, but that was kind of an innovation. So my retreats were all solitary retreats. And I would say that's the case for the 40 or 50 so-called Ritrupa, the mountain meditators above Dharamsala, who were training under Lingrim Rinpoche in those years. And they all would basically either build themselves a hut up in the mountains or find a cave or something like that. Any kind of circumstance where they would have a good degree of privacy and could focus on their practice. And at the same time, stay within reach of the Lama, of their Lama. In this case, it was always Ling Rinpoche with most of those, although some of them, Trijang Rinpoche also supervised some of those retreats and so forth. So in our case, we'd first get the, sort of, you could say the complete, what's called Wang Lung Ti in Tibetan, the initiation, the Lung, the oral transmission, and the Ti, the explanation. And Ti, as they said, there's 4 ways to do that, but anyway, some are very detailed and some are like very literal, bit by bit, where you do a little, like half of page 1, and then you do a retreat on whatever material is covered there, stuff like that. And others, Nyuntri, which is experiential. And mine have always been experiential, which means the Lama, you sit with your Lama and he tells you what he wants, what he thinks is best for you. You chit-chat back and forth and you work out a schedule and work out a framework of your practice. So my initiations were always received by Ling Rinpoche, and usually the transmission, sometimes by Ling Rinpoche, Trijang Rinpoche, sometimes by Dalai Lama. He also occasionally gave those as a sort of an add-on or a tack-on, you could say, to his various public events teachings. And when I was living in Dharamsala for those 12 years, he would teach usually for a couple of weeks in spring, sometimes a couple of weeks in early autumn, and then in the winter he'd go to either Bodh Gaya or Varanasi and teach for 2 weeks or a month, and sometimes add on so-called lung onto those. And then we have what we call the Trubpun, the practice monitor. It means a Lama who's done those retreats, and then with whom you have direct connection or direct conversation or communication for how your retreat is going and what kind of experience are arising, those kind of things. So in my case, that was Geshe Ngawang Dargay, who the Dalai Lama had appointed as the tutor, the main tutor to all foreigners coming to Dharamsala wanting to study Tibetan Dharma. And so generally, one of those I did up in Tushita, which was a retreat center created by Lama Yeshe. And Lama Yeshe very graciously, and he died in, I think, 84 or something, but he very graciously allowed me to use his actual retreat hut up there. At the time, I think they had about only 6. They're sort of built A-frame style, and each one was a complete kind of unit with the little meditation sleeping area and then a bathroom. And food was brought to the rooms 3 times a day from the main house. And those were solitary retreats, meaning you don't meet anyone during those times unless it's an emergency. I did my first retreat like that. And a few years later, and I was able to rent a house that had a cabin on the corner of the room. So it was about 1.5 acres of land that was owned by an Indian Army colonel as part of his properties in the area, and he was up in the army in Kashmir for many, many years. So that house had been rented by a great Tibetan Lama called Ta Lama, who passed away, and after he passed away, it went out for rent and to foreigners. And so I managed to get that for 5 or 6 years. And they had a servants' quarter house, sort of at the back end of the privacy of the property. And so that, after that, served, whenever I do retreats, served as my retreat hut. Sometimes later we moved again, and I built a little retreat hut myself just out of apple boxes and a couple of 2x4s, which was doing the no sleep retreat. And so during that time, you make yourself a box and sit up in it, and you don't lie down or formally sleep. You kind of nod off a few times between sessions but you do it as a kind of a practice of sleep dream yogas.
I'd like to come back to that dream retreat, actually, because that's where we're heading in terms of the 6 yogas next. But what is a typical day in retreat if it wasn't that special kind of sleeping one?
Well, usually all tantric practice talks about Tunshi Naljor, the 4-session yoga. That means you do 1 session in the morning before sunrise, and then you do one just after lunch. Usually when you're doing 4-session yoga like that, lunch is a little bit on the early side, so you don't get all sleepy during your evening session. Then you do a early morning, mid-morning, mid-afternoon, and evening session, basically. Anywhere from 2 to 4 hours each, depending on your sort of enthusiasm, you could say, really more dependent on your feeling. So mine, I always schedule 2.5 hours at a session. And usually you break that in 2, or your knees get a little solid and your bottom gets a little, a little bit of pain in knees and buttocks from sitting without moving for a long time. So usually you do about an hour or so, hour and 10 minutes, and then take a 10-minute break, get up, stretch your legs. Usually you don't consider that as breaking the retreat. You just sort of get up and either do mantras slowly or walk slowly with mind on breath, that sort of thing. And so that's a kind of a very standard format, unless you're doing a specialized training. In other words, otherwise, your teacher or your monitor can give you any other advice that she thinks was more befitting of your needs.
Like what?
I'm doing 6 sessions shorter, or 8 1-hour sessions with, say, an hour in between, or 45 minutes in between, or just doing longer sessions with no breaks in between, depending on your health and physical conditioning and stuff like that. And sometimes other kind of things like, some people, when they do a lot of sitting and meditation, if the mind or the energies become a little bit lethargic, in Tibetan they call that Chingwa Tromo, sort of subtle lethargy, subtle lethargy. Just coming to terms with not having the stimulation of the attention span, so to speak. No channel changer in your hands. This sitting with just meditation can be in itself slightly exhausting, and sometimes can create a kind of a subtle torpor or exhaustion. And also, I think the body chemistry, Tantra is very much connected, as we mentioned in an earlier session, with what kind of chemistry is being, the bindu or the tigle is being generated through the 5 or 7 chakras. In other words, what your psychoneuro system is doing, how is your brain, dopamine and ephedrins, and the thyroid and the pancreas and the gallbladder, these sort of vital vessel organs, how they're performing and how the energies and drops, the kind of inner juices that support consciousness, how these are flowing. So sometimes someone will be told to just cut your session in half and do either kora, just walk around the mountain of your retreat, for instance, for an hour, like do 2 or 3 1-hour walks between sessions or as part of one of the sessions, or to do prostrations. That's not unheard of. Mandala offerings in 6 yogas is very popular because it's mentioned as one of the 6 formal preliminaries. And it could be a Vajrasattva practice, which is a break from your main practice, and you might do that walking as opposed to sitting. So those kind of things, depending on how your body and mind are adapting to the uniqueness of a kind of a meditative marathon, if one were to call it that.
And you must have begun those retreats in your 20s, I presume. And how did you take to it, those early retreats?
Well, I think it's always, retreat is always very pleasant when you start it, because it's very exciting, the change from a daily routine, which is one kind of routine, to something very different. So, as they say, a change is as good as a rest. So the first days of retreat are always very invigorating, simply because one is so enthusiastic and whatnot. But after it sets in and you come down to the sort of hard work side of the retreat, then you're dealing with a different kind of emotional environment and energy environment, you could say. But I think doing at a younger age is a very good thing to do, very wonderful thing to do. That too late, they say if you do it too late, it's quite difficult to maintain the energies well, your body. If you do them in your 50s or 60s, it's not as effective as doing them in your 20s or 30s. For everyone, I'm not for everyone, but as a general rule, I should say. There are plenty of examples of people who didn't start practicing until they were much older, 50s, 60s, 70s, even some in their 80s, and still had very good results. But as a general rule, starting younger does make for a more promising, does afford a promise of more clear and quick results. I think that's generally true.
I interviewed recently a lady who did the first 3-year retreat that Kagyu Rinpoche put on for Westerners it was in Canada, I believe.
Yeah, on the Salt Spring Island.
Mm-hmm. And she was talking about and it's commonly said, the psychological difficulty of that extended period of seclusion.
Of course, in that case, it's not really total seclusion. Kagyu Rinpoche always organized group retreats, the Karma Kagyu tradition. So they're always in groups. I think the biggest problem with those is other people driving you bananas. I think it really is. There's benefits to it. Whatever you do, there's benefits, and there's some sort of limitations created by the environment. So the benefit, obviously, is that you have a wonderful situation with everything taken care of. And you've got people doing exactly the same schedule as you, so it's kind of automatic. You'll do it. You'll sort of have to fall in line, or people will notice. So the fifth Dalai Lama, in one of his commentaries, when he's talking about when you do a retreat, he said, he makes a suggestion. A lot of people go into a retreat and they start sleeping a lot. And that is one downside, is if you're by yourself, you may just think, oh, I'm a little bit lethargic. I think I'll just go take a 2-hour nap in the middle of the day, kind of thing. And if you're in a group, you can't do that. So that's the support of having the group. And also you have some Lama there who has completed the 3-year retreat before, usually called a Trumpan or a practice navigator or something like that. But the downside is you're locked in this sort of place with another 10 or 20 people. And I think in Kagyu Rinpoche's case, most of those were all strangers to one another before, because that was his first retreat center. So some people from wherever he had gone and taught, and they just hopped in. A friend of mine did that as well. And I bumped into him a couple of years ago in Kathmandu. He was on tour. Yeah, so the downside is, you can get driven a little bit bananas by that close proximity to people you don't necessarily like for such a long period of time. I used to bring Lama tours to the West, and we'd sort of live out of a van for a year. And these monks who in the monastery, they aren't really connected with one another very closely. They're just put together for their talents in doing sacred music and dance at Templeton. So in the monastery, they have their own friends, and some of them are in different departments of the monastery and all that. And being locked up in a van together for a year on the road, they get sort of, what did they call it? Cabin fever was what we used to call it in Canada for people who would get contracts in fishing or lumbering or hunting or other sort of things. And you end up in a cabin in a remote place with people you don't necessarily like. And yeah, so there is that issue there. But that doesn't arise when you're doing a retreat by yourself. You've got other issues. One of those are certainly your own kind of inclination to procrastinate might set in. Your own laziness can, of the three kinds of laziness, one is doing something else instead of what you're supposed to be doing. So those can always come up.
Were you ever tempted to disappear into the mountains and be one of those 50 or 60 people above Dharamsala, sort of lifetime retreat? Is that ever something that gripped you, because you travel so much and you're so, if you went out there, did that ever take your fancy at that time?
No, not really. I think some people do those kind of retreats, but that's really a kind of a personal inclination. I'm not really an antisocial person by nature, and that's a little bit of an antisocial way of approaching Dharma. And there are people who have done that and do it successfully, but it's not everyone's cup of tea. And from my side, I really very much appreciated Ling Rinpoche, Trijang Rinpoche's approach to practice, and also certainly Dalai Lama and those 2 or 3 lamas he appointed to guide us, where the emphasis is on integration into daily life. The emphasis with the 2 Yongzhen and Dalai Lama and teachers appointed, the lamas appointed to sort of give special attention to Western students, was in integration. And I think one problem with longer retreats is often people coming out of those are people have a real problem of getting back into living on planet Earth. They're in some remote place with a very specific set of conditions, and living outside of those conditions can be problematic. So I know from that first retreat on Salt Spring Islands, I met several people coming out of that, and although they were very enthusiastic going in and coming out, the ones I met, one maintained good practice thereafter, but 2 of them just kind of came out and spent like 2 or 3 or 4 years trying to reintegrate into paying bills and getting ordinary tasks done. Because in those retreats, everything's taken care of for you. So leaving is a little bit like being a baby leaving the womb, or being a baby bird kicked out of the nest. So there's a lot of people do have a lot of serious problems reintegrating. I think in old Tibet, not so much, because if you just stayed in retreat, local people had been, sending you up your food and whatever else you needed for survival, and so integrating wasn't so difficult. But in our Western society, after 3 or 4 years, when you disappear out like that, a lot has changed, and getting back into ordinary life or conventional life, or whatever one wants to call it, can be a bit of an issue. And it is, I would say, in well over 50% of the cases of people doing a long retreat. So for myself, whatever retreats I did, I would just always go and discuss either with Trijang Rinpoche or Ling Rinpoche, or Geshe Darge was my main sort of monitoring person. Just discuss with them what to do, and it would be a very kind of smooth transition to do this. Why don't you try this and try that? And it's not like they say you should do this or should do that. It's kind of a collaborative effort. I think there's a lot of leeway in Gelugpa to accommodate kind of the speciality of the student, or the unique quality of the student, or unique psychological limitations and needs, or whatever, I like to think about it as, in my case, the unique excellences of the student. But all of those come into play. And for instance, when I was quite young in my training, maybe a couple of years, and I'd grown very fond of Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa, who founded the FPMT. And under them, there was kind of always a kind of a fury for people to become monks or nuns, to take ordination. And one year when Lama Yeshe came and gave a series of teachings, again, that sort of the wind of that emotion was sort of driving the boats floating on the lake of Dharamsala waters. And I went to Ling Rinpoche and said, "What do you think? Looks like kind of a nice way to go. You know, get your hair cut. You only have to have one set of clothes, one change for when you're washing them, and you don't need much. And what do you think?" And he picked up his dice and did a divination. He looked at me and said, "No." So that was that. Then he laughed very hard. He says, yeah, no need. Monks and nuns are. Then he put it from the other side. People who have uncontrolled minds and uncontrolled anger and passion, it's good if they become monks and nuns, because they have 253 vows of things that you don't do this and don't do that. And all of these 253 vows that they take, or precepts that they take, are all intended to sort of limit their ability to fall into great fits of passion or fury. So he quoted that as kind of a statement by the Buddha. And he laughed and he says, no, just practice, stick to Tantra and you'll do well. Becoming a monk or nun, of course, is a sutra ordination. There is no tantric monk or nun, although some people will say he's a tantric priest. You can become like with this robe hair, or you take 19 presets of things you should do every day, but you don't take any presets of things not to do. And so when Kyabje Ling Doje Chung said, just stick to Tantra, that was his meaning. Think in terms of 19 things to keep together every day rather than 253 things to avoid every day. And some of those were things I wouldn't want to avoid. You know, sex, I mean, it's a very wonderful part of human life, not only human life, but all mammals. Not only mammals, but even fishes, although fishes are not so exciting perhaps as mammals. But I couldn't say on that issue for sure. And having an occasional drink of alcohol and things like that, that monks shouldn't do, because I think if you're in a big community like that too, you have to have more don't do this and don't do that, or you'll end up with internal fisticuffs every few days between members of the Sangha. Yeah, so I never had any wish for that. And when, in terms of retreats, I would just go to my one of my three main sort of people, Ling Rinpoche, Trijang Rinpoche, or Geshe Darge, and say, I'm thinking about this, what's your opinion, and just give guidance for what you think would be most useful.
So quite proactive, really.
Yes. I mean, whenever you visit the lamas, they'll sort of coax out of you without being at all intrusive. It's sort of like, when you watch some movies of Hollywood movies of like American native culture, the way the old grandfathers don't just put down an order from on high in some sort of Confucian sort of military way, but rather they'll sort of coax out of everyone those people's opinions on the subject under discussion. So if I would visit Ling Rinpoche, Trijang Rinpoche, or Geshe Darge, they would never just from their side say, I think you should do this, or I think you should do that. And that's why people, I once heard, you often hear Richard Gere did a little bit of Dzogchen study with Sogni Tulku, and you'll often hear it said, yes, the Dalai Lama sent him to Sogni. Doesn't work like that. Basically, you go to Gelugpa, you go to a Lama and you say, I'm thinking of doing this, what do you think? And he'll say, okay, or he may say, well, in terms of the training that you're doing, that may or may not go with their schedule for your other sort of things you're doing, and look at other things in your life that are going on and see that it fits in well. And if you can get all that together, then sure. But they don't generally say, do this or don't do that, or I strongly recommend this or I strongly recommend that. What they strongly recommend in Gelugpa generally is that you do 4 daily sessions of a length, each of a length that works with your own personal lifestyle. And I think that's why Tantra was very successful over the years. For instance, in India, we have King Suchandra and King Indrabhuti and people like that running whole countries, ministers, with ministers and matters of state and war and economics and health and drought and famine to deal with, but they achieved enlightenment, not because they ran to the mountains or did a 3 or a 10-year retreat, but because they basically maintained strong daily practice. I think daily practice in Tantra really means that you get the essence of what the training is trying to do. And in the new school Tantras, like Gelugpa, Kadampa, Kagyu, Sakya, Gelugpa, Shalupa, those kind of schools, the essence is the 3 blendings, to always keep the center of your heart in a state of utter stillness and radiant clarity and wide awakeness, and your emotion and thoughts to have joyful and playful. And that when you actually move your physical body, it's like a dance with the universe, in which you try to emanate in perfect rhythm and beat and movement with the universe that you're in, with that particular point at the universe with which you are interacting. Last weekend, I was teaching at the Jewel Heart Center in Cleveland, and teaching Machi Lupton's lineage of Chöd. And one thing I really love about this sort of Chöd comes basically as a way of interpreting the Chakrasamvara or Heruka Tantras, but taken in a particular way, designed by that great female mystic, Machi. But you really only have to do 4 things. And one is walk like a tiger, which means keep your mind always in the state of great bliss. Your energy is always blissful, joyful, engaged, fearless like the tiger as well. And then hop like a yogini, or skip like a yogini. Means that as you're going through all the things of the universe that generate great bliss, from the alarm going off in the morning and the smell of coffee and walking to your meditation seat and so forth, keeping in mind the reality that beyond appearance is the shunya, or emptiness or infinity nature of every moment. And the third pointer, coil like a snake. Between the dance of great bliss on the one hand and the experience of the infinity nature of every experience on the other hand, sitting perfectly poised between those two, with your coil moving this way or moving that way, to fully keep the perfect balance of infinity and the finite in any given moment. And then from the fourth, dance like an angel. Whatever comes, dance with it joyfully, dance with it celebratorily.
You mentioned that special kind of retreat where one doesn't sleep, or as you said, sort of nods off occasionally, but doesn't formally lay down. And that retreat is specifically to explore and learn the dream yoga practices. And in fact, in our last podcast, you did mention a bit about the dream yoga practices and how that interacts with the Bardo teachings, and you sort of blended those together. Could you describe a little bit that retreat that you did, and perhaps weave into that some sort of summary of the basic idea of the dream yoga, or the 4 dream yoga trainings that are there as part of the 6 yoga system?
Well, generally speaking, the problem with penetrating the dream state is really comes down to one's ability to introspect, if you will, or turn consciousness from sensory activity to inner activity. That really means when we're walking around, an airplane flies by overhead or an eagle or anything, you look at it and your mind goes on that and goes away from what's going on inside. So one of the lamas I know once said, samsara is looking outside, nirvana is looking inside. So nirvana here meaning a kind of a place of inner peace where quiet and beyond stress, anxiety, compulsive thought patterns, obsessive compulsive emotions and so forth, beyond all of that. So how does one get there is the issue. How does one manage to turn about? I think of this expression by Lama Govinda in Foundations of Tibetan Buddhism, a book he wrote, I think in his late 50s, early 60s, I can't remember. The foundation is of Tibetan Buddhism. He termed it as turning about in the deepest seat of consciousness. And it's a little bit like the movie Rosemary's Baby. Normally we're looking this way. How do you turn the head around to look all the way behind you at what's going on inside? And do that on the multiple dimensions. So in Tantra, well, they often speak about 7 basic dimensions of consciousness leading up to fundamental consciousness or foundation consciousness. That foundation consciousness being called different things in different schools, but in Tantra often just mother clear light. And when we get more and more into more subtle states of consciousness, merely either remaining aware when you were in that frequency of being, and secondly, coming out of it, having any recollection of it. Those 2 issues arise. And so I say sleep and dream yoga as a yogic practice is really learning to stay awake in more subtle inner states when you're awake. In other words, to be self-aware rather than to just notice it as a drifting off into a thought pattern or drifting off into a kind of a falling asleep when you're sitting up, those kind of 2 states. So I think when one does retreat, part of getting to know oneself is noticing that behind the great theater of external display are the many fluctuations of consciousness that rise and fall, and becoming more aware of those rather than of the drama of the external display. And then as one gets into them, being able to maintain some kind of meditative or yogic inner posture. And something like that is what it comes down to. So the not sleeping, lying down business, I think one reason for it is that you get a little bit kind of exhausted, and then you fall asleep for a little while, and it's a little bit uncomfortable. So after a half hour or so, just the weight of the bones pressing here or there will cause a little bit of bodily pain. Not enough to hurt, but enough to snap you awake. So in terms of the dream yoga exercise, you can sort of watch the 7 dimensions of consciousness as these 7 states of the energy dissolution supporting consciousness as those energies or drops, as they're called in Tantra, the lung or the prana or the bindu, as they dissolve, slowly observing or closely observing the transformations that take place. And in the course of one night, you can maybe do that 10 times because you nod off and then you wake up. So then you sit up again and then watch. And so it's a way of sort of, then when you fall into it, immediately you're there, you start having some sort of dream. And so then you wake up and you notice, oh yes. So gaining access to the dream state is sort of like being a little bit of a drunken sailor walking down an unknown street with endless bars and houses of pleasure and beautiful ladies you've known from your previous visits to that part of town when your ship pulled into that port, except it's all your dreams. And so I think the sitting up retreat helps with that a lot, because you have 8, 10 times in an evening, you get to notice how you're falling asleep. And all the texts state universally that to yogically access the dream state, you have to be able to maintain meditative self-awareness during those 7 energy dissolutions leading up to Mother Clear Light, and then flipping from clear light into the dream state. And that has many other side benefits and many other applications as well. For instance, in the Zen tradition of Korea, at the end of every long retreat, whether it's 10 weeks or 2 months or 3 months, the standard one is just a little over 3 months. At the last week of that, usually they do it without any sleeping and just sitting up all the time. And I think that has a different purpose than sleep dream yoga, but we won't go into that here.
Do you remember the first time you managed to track those 7 layers of consciousness and then flip from that clear light into the dream state? Do you remember the first time that happened?
Well, maybe. It's always difficult to tell, I think, what is your imagination, what is wishful thinking, and what is an actual identifiable state. And secondly, I think in the Buddhist tradition, one isn't supposed to say too much on that side of things, or some people might say you're boasting and bragging. And I'm an Irishman, and we love to boast and brag, so we have to be especially careful not to boast and brag. But I would say, yeah, within a week of doing a retreat, one has a distinct experience in which it seems like that's what happens.
And from that point, a whole very fascinating series of tasks are to be undertaken within the dream state, such as making things big and small and...
Right. So, when we're in that 6 yogas system from Naropa, also the 6 yogas from Nyingma, in both of those systems, they talk about 4 sort of levels of competence. And these 4 levels are accomplished by means of various yogic applications. Yogic applications here, because you're fast asleep and you're in a dream state. So it really means a mental fluctuation, a fluctuation of mental concentration. Yeah, so in the first of those, just Milam Zimba in Tibetan, which just means when you're dreaming, being aware that you're asleep and dreaming. Being able to develop that quality which can recognize when you're dreaming and when you're not. Like, for instance, right now we could be dreaming and just not be recognizing it. And if we were accomplished in dream yoga, we'd be able to say, no, I don't have to pinch myself to see if I'm dreaming or not dreaming. Even if you pinch yourself, maybe you dreamed you pinched yourself and you dreamed you felt the pinch. So the first of that is being able to slip in and out of dreams without losing the sense of slipping in and out of dreams. Being able to dream consciously and with full memory of the dream content. And just to be able to be there and observe it as a kind of a inner psychic drama or adventure. And so it's not a kind of a Jungian way of doing it where you're going to analyze it or anything like that, although, I'm sure Jungians would have a field day doing that with what many people dream. For instance, in Korea, I had one monk who could never dream. He said, I never dream. And so I gave him a dream yoga instruction. And I gave him the initiation for authorizing dream yoga practice, then gave a basic instruction. And that night, all night, he kept dreaming of beautiful, very tough-looking, but very beautiful, ferocious ladies coming and making love to him. And then he would have wet dreams. He'd have orgasms in his sleep, and the orgasm would wake him up, and he'd have to hop up and run to the bathroom, take a shower, and change his pajamas. So we have all kinds of dreams all the time. When Gampopa taught people dream yoga, said he gave them a red string to tie around their penis as a kind of a blessing, so that you wouldn't have wet dreams and lose your energy. Because once you release your energy like that, very often your intensity of your consciousness diminishes until that protein base is remanufactured within your body. So then for 2 or 3 days, you're sort of, what is the expression, running on a half-empty tank. Yeah, so the first level is just that, being able to be fully aware of you. I have many people come up and say, oh yes, I never dream. And sometimes I wake up knowing that I dream, but I couldn't remember anything about my dream. So that first stage is just really marked by when you fall asleep and start dreaming from the get-go, as they say in Alabama, from the get-go, you understand you're dreaming. And the early training is just learning to sit in that awareness and allow the dream to flow without any effort on your side to push it one way or push it another way. And the other 3 levels or 4 levels or 5 levels, depending on which system you're using, are just ways of building up the dream muscle, so to speak. Now, in one sense, everything, this is part of illusory body yoga in the general overall picture of Tantric, the highest yoga Tantra. And so that means it's really trying to notice how the sense of I arises in the flow of the totality of our experience. So whether we're awake or we're asleep, who am I? Our sense of self-identification. Where is it? How's it going? How's it flowing? And how is it? What are the fluctuations in that sense of I? On what do they depend? What gives rise to joy? What gives rise to trepidation and fear? What gives rise to celebration? All these kind of, just noticing how the I sort of is like a balloon on a machine that blows up and then pulls out some of the air, blows up and pulls up, and what it connects with and how all of this interconnectivity with things affects the sense of I, sense of self. And so during the day, the illusory body yoga between sessions is very much into noticing experience, looking at experience. You're driving to work or driving to the shop to buy some tofu to carry home and add some horrible chemicals to them because you're a vegetarian who refuses to eat meat, but you want your tofu to taste like meat. And so you bring it home and do all that to it. Well, noticing how the sense of I is influenced, where in that equation the sense of I goes, and so on. So dream yoga, and it has really the 2 sides to it, the illusory nature side and the examination of the perceiver, the I perceiving or thinking that it is experiencing these things. And later, to facilitate this practice, then once one is able to stay awake in dreams quite vividly and with good recollection of the dreams and without any interference or without jumping in or jumping out, so to speak. If we put it in the context of the 4 examples I gave earlier, of the example of the coiled snake being able to sit between appearance and sense of perceiver, like a snake moving this way when appearance becomes overwhelming and will pull you off and you'll lose sense of the perceiver, or going the other way when the dream object becomes too weak and doesn't maintain its presence. So when that is set in, then going on to the other stages, and Milam Gyerpa really just means changing elements in the dream, being able to exercise conscious presence to some degree within the dream without waking yourself up. That's usually examples given are changing the color of your shirt in your dream. Very small things like that. And another level, Milam Pelwa, being able to insert two of yourself simultaneously into the dream, sort of like a mirror image of yourself. The twin you always wished you had. And then observing how that affects the sense of self and so on. So yeah, you could say a deeper aspect of the sense of self. Now this dream yoga, as I mentioned in our last discussion, I think, or one of the earlier discussions, it's said it's kind of a preparation for Bardo yoga because the way the dream body behaves, the dynamic in the dreams, the dream world is very similar to the way the Bardo body or after death body behaves. The dream environment is very similar to the Bardo environment. So learning to be relaxed, poised, radiantly clear in the dream means that same ability will be quite strong at the time of death and will travel with you into the Bardo. There's like that kind of statement, we see it made very frequently.
Regarding dream yoga, I mean, to get to that point where one is consistently aware of dreaming when one's dreaming is quite a remarkable achievement. And one reads and hears all sorts of stories about the things that can be done when that has been achieved, in addition to the things that you mentioned. For instance, in Namkhai Norbu's book on the subject, he recounts incidents of him visiting his teachers, both alive and deceased, receiving complete teachings, receiving termas, treasure teachings. And there are, of course, stories of prescient dreams, dreams of divination, or diagnostic and even healing dreams.
Yes.
What sort of uses have you seen dreams being put to in those sorts of contexts?
Well, in the traditional texts on it, they discuss two kinds of travel. And one is travel within this world, and the other is travel beyond this world. Dream travel. And like as Namkhai Norbu puts it in his book, then certainly being able to travel and talk to one's teachers who are still alive in this life. This kind of, you can say, traveling in this world. And then traveling to other worlds if one's teachers have passed, and traveling and having some sort of discussion with them. Now again, if we say look at this in a scientific way, I'm not sure we can say any of that really happens, but the important thing in the Buddhist practice isn't whether or not a particular kind of test can measure something is happening or not happening. Well, what we're really looking for is some kind of benefit from us thinking it happens. So, for instance, one year when I was on Mount Kailash, and I thought I was probably not going to survive simply because usually it was not a dangerous situation, but something had occurred that changed my normal physical situation. And so I was feeling a little vulnerable, like I may make it and I may not. And I think a lot of people get that feeling sometime on Mount Kailash Kora. And I was sleeping much higher than I normally sleep. Usually you sleep down fairly near the bottom. But this time we're sleeping quite high at about maybe 17,000 feet. And so halfway through the evening, or 3/4 of the way through the evening in my dream travel, I had a dream of the Dalai Lama coming to visit, or me visiting the Dalai Lama, you could say. We coming together in a space, and it wasn't on the mountain, and it wasn't in his house. It was just some place, celestial space, or some place where it was like inside a circle of light or something like that. But having a very clear one-on-one conversation without the slightest sense that this was not a real discussion. not like watching TV or hearing something sad or like that, but having a sense of total 100% participation in it. And in it, I made a couple of, I raised a number of issues, and Dalai Lama laughed quite hard and then gave me a couple of responses. And from that time, I knew, everything's okay. This is gonna, there's no danger here. There's no issue here. It's more another issue, something going on. So anyway, it was like having a direct audience with him, every bit as real as the 30 or 40 audiences I had with him over the years of being in Dharamsala. It's a kind, you could say, of dream travel. Now, sometimes people will have those kind of lucid dreams naturally, and sometimes they can be done yogically. For instance, when you go to sleep at night practicing dream yoga, you do a guru yoga practice. And I didn't do that night. I didn't make any special effort. I just lay down and watch the elements dissolve and watch myself drift off toward the moment of the tipping point and the great leap across the chasm between waking state and dream state. And lo and behold, was carried on this whole other magnificent journey, if you will. So I think that happens quite naturally to people as just a result of nature or the natural quality of body-mind. So I think one thing in Tantra is not trying to get extraordinary powers or abilities, but really to access all that is the human inheritance, the human natural inheritance, what is naturally available to us. It's not to build some sort of synthetic tool or something like that. In terms of out-of-body travel, on a number of occasions, just dreaming of leaving one's body and going to meeting, for instance, I've met my mother, my father, like that, and so someone might say, yes, you just dreamt about them. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. It can't be proved that I just dreamed about them. It can be proved I did dream about them. Was it a visitation? Was I visiting them? Were they visiting me? That's an issue that cannot be just stated categorically by one side or another side, other than if one cares to do so from one side. For myself, yes, if I want to have some sort of direct communication with one of my ancestors who has passed, I'll do a guru yoga practice, as is in the Dream Yoga manual. Go to sleep and making a strong intent. Tonight I'm going to do this kind of a dream. And when you're in the dream state, basically pointing the mind in that direction, you could say. Dream yoga teaching goes like that. And those of us who practice dream yoga, practicing meaning trying to do the application as taught. So that's how it's taught. The other thing, like Milam Gyurba, transforming things into the dream, is so that when radical dreams arise, you develop the ability to flex the dream muscle without waking yourself up. The main difficulty with dream yoga is the slightest thing can cause you to wake up. And of course, that's the end of dream yoga. Then you're in waking up yoga. If you stay awake, you're in daytime yoga. If you go back to sleep, maybe the yoga sleep and dream again.
Gosh, I imagine those sorts of experiences leave quite a lasting impression.
Well, I think life is itself a very amazing adventure for all humans. One problem we have in modern life is our life, the dimensionality of life is really whittled down to very silly dimensions, very silly boundaries. It's like get up, go to work. Everything's put on waking consciousness. Almost nothing in the Western society is put on deeper level of consciousness. At the very least, if we talk about any emphasis put on deeper level of consciousness, is really more to do with just a kind of a devotion to God or devotion to something, devotion to family. But the other dimensions of reality are, in our society, either considered neurosis or schizophrenia or just being downright crazy. It's unfortunate that we basically, it's like humans hear like 1% of the range of sound. Now, if we can't necessarily change that range that much just by willing it to change, but we do know that those other ranges of sound are out there, and we can use machinery to pick them up, and we do that with all kinds of machines. And the same with things we can see. We can see a certain distance and a certain frequency. We'll use machines. But our Western society has really developed an amazing doubt, or you could say a blasphemous attitude toward the power of mind itself, or the multidimensionality of mind itself. It's really debased the mind to be like the driver of a car. You can turn on the car and drive out your driveway and turn this way and that way and get there and then get home and bring home a few groceries and carry the groceries into the house and cook them up and switch on the TV and go do a couple of internets. And it's basically Western society, modern society in the last couple of 100 years have really totally doubted the viability of mind as an entity other than as the driver of a car. It doesn't really appreciate any real sense of the depth of consciousness and the range of human experience and the meaning of those. It's just something now, I think, that we're starting to look at. I don't like to go into it historically for why it happened, but anyway, that's what we have today. And I think for us living today, one of the great challenges we have is to bring into human life some of those deep, deep venerations for the nature of mind itself that have been sort of chased away. Some historians sort of blame Descartes on this and his relationship with governments. At the time of Descartes, then the government would own your body, and the church could own your mind, and so your mind should just be this thing which kind of gets you to church on time once a week. And between that period, just sort of keeps a basic ethic. Devotional ethic, and it sort of became limited to that. So I think the generation and what the crossroads is to bring back some of the respect for deeper conscious states that were held by many of the great ancient civilizations. And I'm not saying ancient civilizations were idyllic or Shangri-La-like or anything like that, but we had many great qualities in ancient civilizations that have been lost in today's world and purposely cut out of today's world in order to fabricate the kind of plastic society that we've generated, if you will. So Aboriginal cultures in Australia are a perfect example, where dream travel and dream communication was considered natural, with nothing extraordinary about it. But for us, because we didn't have it as a Christian culture then at that time, we considered it sort of the work of the devil, or many of these practices in the Buddhists of India and Tibet. Again, our culture tended to look down them as sort of deviltry or whatever you will, and then there was just as pure superstition and all these kind of things. The first book on the Dalai Lama written in Europe was written by a Christian missionary when chapters had headings like showing that the Dalai Lamas of Tibet are the works of the devil, and showing that the teachings of the Buddha are the works of the, and so on and so forth. So we ourselves, I think, had some of those as ancient Celtic peoples in Europe prior to the Christian invasions or the Roman invasions. And from that time, certainly, there's been some sort of limitation on exploring that aspect of consciousness. Some fear of it, I would say, as well. But and not to blame Christianity or Christians for that. It's part of our history. We can't wash our hands of things which are part of our own ancestry, but we can try to correct them, if you will. And I think looking at the deep respect that some well-preserved ancient traditions maintain towards maps of the mind and dimensions of consciousness is a very, very important work for our generation.
You mentioned there deliberately cut out in order to produce a plastic society. Deliberately cut out by who? And what is the benefit of having produced a plastic society?
I think it's a worldview that developed really at the end of the 1800s, part of the colonial empire age, that sort of thing. But I think, certainly it began with the Inquisitions, the witch hunts, the idea that any knowledge other than this basic utilitarian governing rule that characterized European states, that this was somehow negative, evil, and dangerous. So basically, something like 2 million peoples who had showed any degree of psychic ability or deeper appreciation of the qualities of consciousness, something like 2 million of them were put to death, and not always in very pleasant ways. It's okay if someone hits you on the head with a hammer from behind, perhaps, like they did in some of the communist countries or shoot you or something, but very, very painful deaths. Just basically seeing these states as something that had to be eradicated from our society. And then when the communists came in Asia, the communists being impressed by this way of just wiping out anything which is a non-9 to 5 sense of the meaning of life, and just killing millions, sometimes tens of millions of people, just to guarantee that this view that life is not a mere 4-dimensional state, that the dimension of mind and dimension of consciousness and psychic phenomena, spiritual phenomena, whatever one wants to call it, is every bit as important, saying that is the most dangerous phenomena. Still, we see in China today, Falun Gong starts getting a little bit of strength because they're showing that just doing simple Tai Chi exercises, a few mantras, can produce a lot more happiness than many more expensive activities. And suddenly this is seen as a great threat to communist control. Or their fear of the Dalai Lama and Tibetan Buddhism, exactly the same. So I think the purpose of development of a plastic society is very often the 5 to 10% of the people who are using the other 90% of the people as work slaves in one way or another. It's in their interest to basically have everyone have this sense that, yes, get up, put your kid in kindergarten quickly, then put him in school quickly so that he has a very good education and can go to college and can come out and get a very good job working for, well, it used to be Serge Roebuck or Naranda Mines or something like this. And that's the be-all and end-all of life. And you raise your kids, and then they grow up, and you've done a great job. You've produced the next generation of worker bees or worker ants. And meanwhile, the idea that any of these could become anything exceptional other than invent a new teapot or a better mousetrap or something like that And then these people pat themselves on the back. Yeah, we've done such. Life is so much better. Americans, this, Europe, this, and then we've done so much easier now. We can just put a piece of toast in the oven, and we don't have to light a fire. Well, that's, of course, it's nice to have a toaster. Nothing against toasters, but the idea that somehow this proves that a completely plastic society dedicated to nothing but procreation, the so-called rat race, and that the mind itself is really just a little kind of like when you turn on a car, the gas makes it go zoom. And it's really, it's no wonder that human society today is a very unhappy society. Even in America, we have over 20 million people taking antidepressants. Meanwhile, we're patting ourselves on the back saying, greatest civilization in the world, all these freedoms. People running around 20 million or more taking antidepressants. So it's a plastic society in that it's limited the human model to a very small framework of enviable behavior. Nobody wakes up and says, I hope my child turns out to be a great mystic or a great thinker or a great wanderer. People just have the sense that, well, I hope he does okay in kindergarten and does reasonably well in high school, gets into a good college, gets a decent job, makes a couple of nice kids, and it's all just kicking the can down the road and hoping the next generation will fix the situation.
Do you think the 5 to 10% that you mentioned retain access to those different dimensions? Or is it a wholesale denial even among that, if you want, in the know group?
One of the books which was really instrumental in my young life was Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And later that was made into a movie that won Academy Awards for some of the truths that it told. But it really did bring to mind very much, and this has been said in many Buddhist traditions, many world traditions, that the real thinker thinks things are exactly the opposite of what generally society is trying to project them to be. Like Lama Dromtapa said, great disciple of Atisha, most of the world has Gelugpa, the head's on backwards. In other words, they're completely mistaking main points of life. And I love in the Chöd tradition some other analogies they use. From the beginning, see your body as a corpse. Think I'm already dead. And the Book of the Samurai, when you train in martial arts, often give that same, see yourself as already dead. The reality is we already have a death sentence on us. So everything we do should be in that context. See as your mind as the bearer of the corpse, the one carrying the corpse to be buried or burned or thrown in the river or fed to the birds, whichever the 4 elements you want to donate it. And in the meantime, use your presence of having that corpse to achieve as much inner greatness you can yourself before you have to put that corpse down, and also to benefit the world as much as possible, because once you put that corpse down, your ability to transform society in any kind of a spiritual way has fallen from your hands. You have that amount of time to get whatever done that you think could be done. So I don't think the world is evil or bad or anything like that. So therefore, the Buddha used the word kunzobdampa, or in Tibetan's translated kunzobdampa, deceptive nature of the appearance of being. The deceptive nature of the appearance of the life phenomena. We're easily zishi. We're easily distracted by the shiningness, the shinings. What's often referred to as the eight worldly winds, the eight worldly dharmas in Tibetan world. Fear of chasing pleasure, hiding from pain, chasing gain, running from loss, chasing applause, trying to repress criticism, and chasing recognition or honor, and trying to avoid people, anything that seems to dishonor us. None of which has any meaning if you're a corpse. And so it's only as meaningful as it can be used. So like the seventh Dalai Lama says, whatever you get in your life, see it as something borrowed that you can use in a creative way. So the human society goes through ups and downs. And in India, this word Kali Yuga, or the down, we're on a little bit of a downslide for the last few thousand years, where the rank materialism or gross materialism or vulgar materialism outranks other qualities. So, for instance, when we hear Martin Luther King say something, I look for the day when people are judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. Well, I think almost everything on earth today, almost all society, probably 99 or more % of people in the world today, judge things less on the content of their character, but instead on other superficial landmarks, if you will. And someone very educated looks at an uneducated person and thinks that person is ignorant or stupid. Uneducated person will look at the overeducated person and think he's completely stupid because he's so overeducated he can barely tie his own shoes. We put our way of addressing everything on very particular demarcations that are completely opposite to what Martin Luther King was talking about. Of course, color of skin is one thing, but it's one of hundreds of such ways in which we avoid looking at the content of character. Now, content of character in spiritual traditions is not something inborn. Nobody's born a good person or a bad person. They may have some good things going for them and some bad things going for them, but in reality, if we look at content of character, it's not something that is just there. It's an ongoing day-by-day challenge for everyone in life. So it doesn't matter if you're a New Guinea headhunter, or if you're a Roman Catholic, or a Buddhist, or a soldier, or an atheist. Every day, the content of your character is something which is challenged, and it's something which transforms day by day, week by week, month for month. And it goes in a sort of a positive way, or it can go in a negative way, or it can just become completely confused and tied up in knots. So from my side, I think all those traditions that advocate looking in as the key to life happiness are much more useful than those looking out. Of course, we have to look both ways, like the snake coiled in the middle in the Chakrasamvara 4 analogies. We have to be able to strike out on the appearance of things and strike in at the infinity of things. But it has to be a balanced perspective. And that balance, seeing that the inner is at least as strong, if not stronger, than the outer, because the outer is always in a state of flux, and we have less power over it. The inner is something which is with us 24 hours a day. Nobody can, as Nelson Mandela put it in one of his statements, nobody can rob us of that. He borrowed that or stole that from a poem by Lord Tennyson. And he quotes Tennyson when he says it, so he borrowed it. But it's something that if we can always keep that as our priority, I think, then we're contributing to the de-plastification of society. Anyway, that's dream yoga. Let's get back to dream yoga then. It's, I think in our Western society, it has not been at all a subject of discussion outside of Jungian interpretation. Whereas in the Buddhist world and many of the other ancient traditions of the world, certainly North American natives and certainly Aboriginals, certainly in India, we see a lot of discussion of it, and some with the Taoists of China, that those states of mind, dream states, are every bit as important, perhaps even more important than the waking states.
I think that's a wonderful place to leave it, Glenn. Thank you very much.
Well, my joy, my pleasure. Dankjewel, dankjewel.
Alsjeblieft, they say here. Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.